Guess that's the cue. I'd like to welcome everybody to our latest installment of the Critical Minerals Seminar, hosted by the African Extractivism and Green Transition Research Partnership. And today, I'm really excited and looking forward to a presentation on a new book, Living Minerals, Nature, Trade, and Power in the Race for Lithium, by our featured presenter, Professor Javiera Barandiarán from UC Santa Barbara. My name is Richard Saunders. If you haven't been attending before, I'm an associate prof here at the Department of Politics, York University, where I teach African political economy, work on minerals, also teach more widely on development. I'm the project director of AEGT, African Extractivism Green Transition. And we've been mounting these critical mineral seminars for more than a year. We've had great attendance, lots of feedback, so we'll be continuing to do that. This is our last one for the current Northern academic term, winter term. We'll be resuming in September. If you'd like to find out more about the project, what the next seminars will be, and other elements of our knowledge mobilization, including podcasts, working papers, and the various projects which we have in the field right now, here in Southern Africa, please visit our website. It's www.aegt.ca, and you'll find a lot of that information there, including a recording of today's webinar. I want to thank Alex Caramento, the project manager for the AGT, for organizing this and with the assistance of some of our York graduate RAs. So thank you to everybody involved. As we begin, I think since we're coming together from different continents and with a focus on a mineral which is problematically extracted in a range of places around the global south, I think it's a fitting time to reflect on York and the institution which is hosting this, and some of our own connections, problematic and hopefully optimistic going forward, to the land. So as we begin, let's pause to acknowledge, with the land acknowledgement, the location and context for the host organization. First Nations peoples have lived on the area around York, on Turtle Island, for millennia, stewarding the land, the water, and all that contributes to life in this region. Today, the culture and presence of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples enriches the lands and people of this territory. More than 2 centuries ago, the Mississauga people welcomed settlers to this territory, providing sustenance and engaging in trade and commerce. Between 1781 and 1820, 8 treaties were signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who opened their territory to settlement. Today, York University's Keele campus, where this is being broadcast from, is located on the Toronto Purchase Treaty number 13 lands and is situated on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Treaty history is foundational for us at York and in Canada, and it's our collective responsibility to honor the land as we honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here and those who are yet to come. We're grateful for the opportunity to be learning, working, and thriving on this land, and we commit to learn the truth, be active in the process of reconciliation. If I could put in a few words as we could begin about the AGT. For those of you who don't know us, we are a 6-year project focused on 4 countries in Southern Africa, but with a wider reach, those 4 countries being Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And our aim is to look across a range of research clusters, from artisanal small-scale mining, taxation, industrial policy, and international linkages, to try to understand the evolving dynamics of national level and regional level policymaking around critical minerals. It's a challenging, sometimes unwieldy project, but we've been making progress. This past year, we've had 8 independent field research projects in the field. One of them involves one of our speakers today in a comparative project with Argentina. And what we're trying to do, both by working within these countries and collecting local level firsthand information from various stakeholders, some of them often marginalized in policymaking processes. What we're trying to do is to address not only the scholarly research gaps around critical minerals, but also policy-facing research gaps, particularly by marginalized communities, and to contribute co-created knowledges and evidence to policy-making processes with the aim of improving the outcomes, the imprints, the processes, the experiences of critical minerals as many African countries get dragged into global value chains in a very difficult, sometimes confusing, and sometimes belittling environment for Africans. So that's, if you want, our mission statement. And part of our project is to listen and learn from others in other areas from South Asia, other parts of Africa, but particularly Latin America, where debates and experiences of engagement of critical minerals and global supply chains and the politics surrounding are in some ways far advanced, and we feel we have a lot to learn from these experiences, from the literature, from the research, and from methodologies. So that leads me to say I'm really excited and really looking forward to today's presentation, which is on a new book. In and of itself, but also to see what we in the AGT and our African partners can take from this and contemplate upon. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So it's now my pleasure to formally welcome our featured speaker, Dr. Javiera Barandiarán, joining from Southern California, and our discussant, who's no stranger to the AGT, Professor Craig Johnson from University of Guelph, who's joining us from Argentina. Javiera is Associate Professor in Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the director of the Center for Restorative Environmental Work. She is widely published in English and Spanish, with at least 4 books, including the one she'll speak to today, Living Minerals, but also an interesting book on science and environment in Chile, and a monograph from Palgrave Macmillan, Demanding a Radical Constitution. In addition to these books, she has produced an array of journal articles and book chapters, and is presented widely across North America, South America, and Europe. What I find really interesting about your CV, Javiera, is the kind of things that we like to do as well. And it's public-facing writing of different kinds, including photographic books and reflections upon iconography and images and cultural experiences. And particularly interested in that regard is last year's Lithium Landscapes, which is a photo book on brine mining in Chile and Nevada. So congratulations, that really interesting work. Javiera's research on lithium has been funded by SSHRC, the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which also funds the AGT, the National Science Foundation, the Chile Research Agency, and these are among many other public and private agencies and foundations. Before we start, I'd just like to briefly reintroduce Craig, who's been a participant before as a presenter and participant in our seminars. Craig is a professor of political science at University of Guelph, a specialist in environmental politics, international development, agrarian change, and his work primarily focuses on the political economy of mining and a just and renewable energy transition. He leads the PI for Lithium Frontiers, a SSHRC-funded insight grant looking at lithium mining in the Southern Cone, and he is, we're very happy with this, co-director of an AGT comparative study on lithium extraction and community resistances in Argentina and Zimbabwe. A warm welcome to you both. I'm looking forward to the proceedings. I've already taken up far too much time, and so I'm going to leave the space open for you now. Javiera is going to speak for about 45 minutes to present her work. Craig will offer his comments for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion up for 45 minutes, or as long as we have before our 2 hours is up. So once again, thank you so much. Really looking forward to this. Congratulations on the book, and looking to hearing about it and engaging around it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard, for such a warm and rich introduction to the topic and to me and to my work. I am going to be sharing some photos from the lithium landscapes. And just a shout out to my collaborator, photographer, who's also my husband, for full disclosure, Tristan Partridge. He took the photo that's on the cover of Living Minerals, and he took all the photos that are in the Lithium Landscapes book, which is accessible. Both of these books are accessible for download on our website, which is the CREW Center for Restorative Environmental Work website, and the link is right here on this slide. So yes, again, thanks, Richard, for the wonderful introduction and the invitation to be here. Thank you, Alex, as well. And of course, thank you to Craig that I was thinking, I think I can now call you a longtime collaborator since we've been working together since before COVID. So I feel that puts us sort of in a previous era, of time so it's been a good long journey. And I'm really excited to be sharing this research with scholars and practitioners who are working in Africa, and to think about ways in which we can sort of work together and increase sort of the conversation and collaboration across South America and Africa, two regions that have historically and today provided so many of the world's minerals and materials, timber, agriculture, so much. So in a way, kind of two regions that really have been at the center of global extractivism. So I will be sharing from my book, Living Minerals, Nature, Trade, and Power in the Race for Lithium, which is an open access book. So it's freely accessible online and available to everyone. So I wanted to start by sharing how I became interested in lithium already 15 years ago. I was finishing up my dissertation fieldwork on how scientists participate in environmental conflicts in Chile. That led to the book that Richard mentioned about science and environment in Chile. And so I learned at that time that Chile was a major producer of lithium. This was a surprise to me. I had never heard this before. And then when I was back in the United States, I realized news like this was beginning to pop up. And in this particular piece that appeared in the New Yorker, the byline caught my attention. Can Bolivia become the Saudi Arabia of the electric car era? So as someone, I'm, from Chile and Argentina, my family is there. So I have, deep roots to this region. And in this region, there's multiple countries with lithium deposits. I personally found this possibility of the region becoming like Saudi Arabia really alarming. And I think right now, with a United States and Israel-led war in Iran, it's easier to grasp why this is so alarming, than it has been in a while, perhaps. So to me, this signaled more foreign intervention, war, environmental destruction, and grossly unequal development. So again, things that have really been front and center, sadly, in the news in the last 10 days. So, as someone who'd been working in environmental activism and in climate actions for a while, suddenly the prospect of the electric car era seemed like more of the same at the global level and more conflict at the local level. And so this caught my attention, and I decided to turn this into my next major research project. What I want to highlight is that this question, can Bolivia become the Saudi Arabia of the electric car era? It sort of equates all the diverse dreams of Bolivians and Saudi Arabians with just one thing, trade. And what it's easy perhaps to miss is that this question, written by a US journalist, actually says a lot more about the United States than it does about Bolivia. And so in the book, 15 years later, after a lot of research and reflection, what this led me to is the argument that I make in the book, where I argue that to meaningfully address climate equity and climate change, we need to shift from what I call the old paradigm of strategic minerals or critical minerals, which has guided global mineral trading since at least the 1950s, to a paradigm of living minerals, which emerges in partnership with a diverse set of voices, including scientific voices, indigenous, feminist, and ecological practitioners and thinkers. And I argue that living minerals can deliver better climate actions, but it does require that we reckon with some difficult subjects, including environmental political memories, structural inequality, scientific colonialism, and more. Now, if I had to boil down living minerals to just one, so its most minimal expression, it would be this one question: what forms of life will survive this pace and scale of extraction? And so, first, this question makes clear that the problem isn't extraction per se. Humans have been practicing mining, since time immemorial, but it's the intensity, the speed, and the recklessness with which we're doing it, particularly now. And what is really at stake right now is the survival of life itself, our own human survival, but also the survival of so many non-human species that we rely on for our own lives. So it is, an existential crisis in many, many ways. So what I argue is that if this question guided all subsequent decisions, we would be making very different decisions about what, where, how much, and how fast to mine. And I think it's a question, to link it back to your land acknowledgement, that really would help us be more effective in honoring the land in the terms that you laid out, Richard. So thank you for that really wonderful land acknowledgement. Okay, so the problem with resource nationalism or the critical minerals paradigm is that it leads us to a series of false solutions. Primarily, it puts faith in technological fixes, specifically in this case, the electric car, which, as you can see in this graph, electric cars are just getting bigger and bigger and therefore more and more unsustainable. And I can say more about this, of why this is in the Q&A, but this is very acute in the United States, as you can see in this graph, but we see it really everywhere, even in Europe with its small roads, even in China. So globally, just cars are getting enormous, and that's bad news for the environment. So EVs, they use a lot of everything. They're very mineral intensive, not just lithium. But we talk a lot about lithium because markets love it for two main reasons. It is hard to count and map, and this makes it really easy to speculate with, and it leaves intact consumption as if this was a solution to climate change. Now, EVs depend on lithium for their batteries in particular. Lithium is the most lightweight element available, and that's why it's important in portable batteries. And to be clear, EVs are much better than gas or diesel cars, but they're not good enough because they deliver and they reproduce really well-known inequalities and injustices. So bigger, more expensive cars are unaffordable. Mineral and fossil fuel needs pose a direct threat on people's lands and waters, as many of you know in your own research. And it has helped to usher in this resurgence of resource nationalism, where governments seek to control the production and trade of a natural resource to advance national goals like military power and development. So all of this together helps to preserve the carbon economy by advancing the illusion that lithium replaces oil, like like EVs replace gas cars. In reality, in practice, gas cars find new lives elsewhere. So gas cars that are no longer used in California are being shipped, for example, to Africa for use over there. The oil industry is investing in lithium quite extensively, and policymakers and activists are giving much more attention to securing lithium supplies than to closing down the oil industry. So that's the book's argument in a nutshell. The book is organized into five empirical chapters. The first three chapters sort of set the historical context for lithium mining, and I think of particular interest to Zimbabwe, where you are, Richard. There I talk a lot about copper, the copper mining industry, which has a lot of relationship with Zimbabwe during the Cold War. And then chapters 4 and 5 delve into lithium brine mining in Chile and the United States in the 1960s and 1980s. And so, what I'm going to share in my talk today sort of pulls some events and concepts from each chapter. And so the conceptual through lines in the book are these three concepts that I develop. And you'll hear me use these words in today's presentation, but in the interest of time, I just define them very briefly here. So first concept is ontological fluidity, by which I mean that lithium, instead of being singular, it is plural and symbolic. And this is just part of a quality that it has by its very nature. And so it lends itself to different political plays. The second concept is mining memories, which are aspirations that different groups have pinned on minerals for better futures. And I'll talk quite a lot about this in my talk today. And then the third concept is exhausted, so which refers to the multiple ways in which we're living the ecological crisis, which is both, refers to the exhaustion of water, the exhaustion of the conditions that make life possible in a biological sense. But I think I use it also to refer to an exhaustion of ideas and to a kind of moral and ethical exhaustion in how we are engaging with the material world, with the lived world. So I will be, going through these. I'll be using these throughout the talk, which is structured in sort of four main sections. In the first part, I'm going to talk very quickly about lithium. I'm assuming that a lot of people here know a lot about it already, but I've found that it's quite necessary still to sort of establish this common ground for what follows. Then I'll talk about mining memories, and this will present some of the core historical material that's in the book. And then I'll say a little bit more about the living minerals paradigm and some closing reflections. So the scale and intensity of lithium mining has increased dramatically since 2016, as you can see in this graph. And this is due almost entirely to demand for electric cars. Lithium is used in a lot of different things, but this increase is really driven by electric cars and batteries. So to emphasize just a few key points, we are seeing a massive mining boom with really, I would consider them really outrageous projections of future demand that if we were to even try to fulfill, I think would spell doom for life itself. And so in a way, this boom is only getting started. The second key point is that the lithium supply chain is complicated because of the chemistry of lithium and the number of different lithium products that exist. There's over 80 different products that lithium is marketed as. So lithium carbonate, lithium hydroxide, lithium metal, and 80 of these different things. But geographically, the supply chain is really quite simple. Lithium is mined in just a few countries, and then nearly all of it goes to China for manufacturing, which is what the USGS, the US Geological Society, was trying to highlight in this strange graphic that puts China sort of in the center of the world in these ways. So to zoom in on the deposits that I'm focusing on, this is the area of South America that concentrates the largest lithium deposits. Here you have a close-up of this area, which is a high-altitude desert in northern Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And these white spots that you can see are the salt flats from where we extract lithium today. So my focus has been on two salt flats in particular. In Chile, the Salar de Atacama, which is the largest and the oldest salt flat in production in this region. And so the Salar or Atacama salt flat takes its name from the larger desert, the Atacama Desert, where it is located. And my second focus is here in Silver Peak, Nevada, also known as the Clayton Valley, in the United States. And this mine began operating even earlier. So brine mining was pioneered here in California, where I'm currently standing, in a place called Searles Lake in the 1930s. And from there, it moved to Silver Peak in the 1960s, and from there to Chile's Atacama in the 1970s. And so there are direct links between US and Chilean lithium mines, US and Chilean copper mines, and US and Chilean fertilizer mines, several of them marked on this map. And these long-standing links inform the approach that I took in the book. So when it came to lithium, it was the very same people working for the same company, the Foot Mineral Company that I'll talk more about, who built both the Silver Peak mine and the Atacama mine. And what you see here are photos from this photo book I mentioned earlier, Lithium Landscapes, where we pair photographs of these two sites. And so you can see how similar they look. So these are two abandoned signs, one in Silver Peak and one in the Atacama. I relied on archival materials in both countries and a few interviews with strategic informants in terms of my sources for the book. And I was really lucky to find a Chilean archive with business correspondence and reports. And so together with other materials, it allowed me to focus on the trade in minerals and in expertise between these two allied nations. And so I try to, even though I focus on these mine sites, I try to decenter, in a sense, the mine itself to really examine the trade between these countries as a relational encounter. So the other thing that these two sites, Silver Peak and Atacama, have in common is that they are brine mines, and which are compared to the much more common hard rock mining, which we have in Zimbabwe and Australia and other places. It is a lot cheaper and it is less destructive. So here you can see the brine mines in the Salar de Atacama from a commercial flight. So brines are essentially water that's mixed with salts and many other minerals like potassium, boron, calcium, a lot more. And what is really, I think, part of the beauty and part of the ontological fluidity of lithium itself is that every salt flat and every brine is absolutely unique. So the phase chemistry, which is what creates these different colors in the evaporation pools that you can see here, it has to be figured out again for each single brine and salt flat. This infographic provides more details about the extraction process. So the brines are sort of sit in this underground aquifer. They're pumped out and left in these evaporation pools for months. And as the water evaporates, the minerals, some minerals crystallize and others like lithium become concentrated. And then at a certain point, the concentrated brine is sent for processing. So like all minerals, lithium, it is not renewable and it is also not particularly scarce. What is scarce is cheap lithium, and Atacama lithium is the cheapest available still today. Brine mining generates waste and damages the landscape, but the number one concern for local communities has been water, including water lost to evaporation. And so here you see typical pumping infrastructure in Atacama and in Silver Peak, and helps to drive home that this is really a massive water operation that disrupts local water cycles in the desert. So from a climate equity perspective, globally, indigenous communities who have contributed the least to climate change have been among the most punished by colonialism, by modernization, and now by this rush for minerals, all in the name of fighting climate change. And Nevada here in the United States helps to illustrate. So this map shows pre-contact or ancestral Shoshone territory. After 1863, Shoshone families were forced off their land into reservations. Soon after, settler families founded Silver Peak, and today, Shoshone people, in coalition with Paiute and Bannock peoples, are fighting new lithium mines in this region, as you can see in this protest banner that they put up, asserting life over lithium. In Chile, there are 18 Licanantay Atacameño communities near the lithium mines. These two photos are from UC San Diego digital archive of interviews with impacted indigenous peoples. So these are members of the Goyo Ayu, which is very near the lithium mines. Now, there's a shared sense of frustration and worry about the impacts of mining as this desert ecosystem becomes increasingly exhausted, possibly to the point of extinction. As water disappears from this desert, all life is suffering. That includes emblematic species like the flamingo on my book's cover, but also single-cell microbes that are amongst the first forms of life to produce ozone and oxygen on this planet, and therefore made all subsequent life possible. So we might even call these microbial mats our very oldest living ancestors. And the Guardian newspaper released a really beautiful documentary about this recently, just a few weeks ago. You can access it on this link. And this image here is a screen capture from that documentary. And so you can see flamingos on the salt flats sort of overlaid by this single cell microbe. Now, Licanantay, who live in the Atacama region, they farm and they keep animals. They know how to live with water scarcity, and many of them are complaining bitterly about the negative impacts mining is having. So to understand how we got here and why the lithium trade promises to reproduce old patterns of inequality and injustice, I turn to examine the history of mineral trading between the United States and Chile. So for 150 years, the Atacama Desert has been central to global mineral extractivism, providing most of the world's copper and natural nitrates, which are used as fertilizers and for explosives. So the Atacama is not new to mining, and the lithium mining is just the most recent arrival to a long history of really intensive extractivism here. And this painting is a large mural located in the Atacama in a town there that celebrates life in a major Chilean nitrate town in its heyday around 1940. And so you can see in the background of this, bustling village, you can see the miners in the front with their helmets. And in the background, you can see some of the mining infrastructure, and you can see those tabletop mountains, which are the waste piles from the nitrate extraction. This is the same town today. Its refineries and ore processing plants are in ruins. Homes in the town center are vacant. And it is not unique. Across the Atacama, you will find the ruins of past industrial activity. This includes infrastructure that was once valuable, as well as abandoned waste piles of hard rock and toxic mine tailings. And ruins and waste are common also in Silver Peak in Nevada, where the world's oldest lithium brine mine is. If you visit today, you will find intense poverty, abandoned cars and trucks, industrial ruins, empty homes, a vacant village center. As in the Atacama, you can see in the distance the cake-like piles of mining waste. So again, those flat tabletop piles are the waste from 40, 50 years of lithium mining in this town, in this village. Now, this season's greeting card provides a little glimpse of a better time in Silver Peak decades ago. Since its founding, Silver Peak has been a small village of family-run mom and pop mining outfits, and this is how they would describe themselves. These mom and pop mining outfits included the Leprechaun Mining and Chemical Company, which sent out this season's greeting card to its shareholders. Every year they would send their shareholders this sort of Christmas card. And so this card captures a time when capitalism operated with a human face, specifically a human face that was white, Christian, and middle class. And so one of the things I find really fascinating in the story is that Leprechaun was the unlikely group that actually discovered lithium in these Nevada brines and kicked off their development in the 1960s. So at the very same time that the US Geological Survey and that much bigger companies were looking for the next big lithium deposit, it was the wee folk of the Leprechaun Company that actually found it and licensed the project to Foot Mineral. So by contrast to Leprechaun, which was a small Western outfit, Foot Mineral at the time was an East Coast company that was expanding domestically and internationally, including to Zimbabwe, buying the Vanadium Company of America. And so Foot ended up building the Silver Peak mine, and then they took that knowledge and built the Atacama mine. Now, my point here isn't to glorify the past, but to acknowledge what was achieved and what has been lost. Because it is these memories, which I call mining memories in the book, that reflect feelings of nostalgia and melancholy and that are animating resource nationalism in both countries, in both the United States and in Chile. So both Silver Peak and the nitrate towns of the Atacama enjoyed relative prosperity, a sense of community, and pride in what locals saw as honest work. And both lost these achievements even as new mines were built, and that's a really key point, for many reasons, including, I argue, environmental mismanagement rooted in misrepresentations of the salt flats and of these deserts, this desert nature. So this is a point I really want to emphasize. Normally, our explanations for this kind of loss would turn to globalization and the impacts of, free trade, globalization in particular, or poor governance, corruption, bad policies, etc. I argue instead that it has as much or more to do with environmental mismanagement rooted in misrepresentations of nature, which led to systemic inequities and unsustainability. So, in other words, what I call fictions about nature built environmental injustices and unsustainability into the very fabric of the mineral trade. And now lithium, because of its ontological fluidity, is particularly good at revealing how these fictions were made and reproduced and how they shape an unsustainable mineral trade. So demand for lithium increased soon after World War II because of its use in the thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb. And so the magazine Popular Science, for example, that you can see here, touted lithium as the H-bomb metal and promised to, quote, usher in a mining boom to equal any gold rush in history. Big claims. So the H-bomb was and still is the most powerful weapon mankind has ever created. It was so pulverizing that it even led to a backlash and to a banning of H-bomb tests. And it also made lithium a nuclear material. Like all nuclear materials, lithium's nuclearity changed its politics and its economics. In the 1950s, the US Atomic Energy Agency had a secret stockpile, and it was the sole single buyer of lithium, which was produced at the time by just two US companies, Foot Mineral and the Lithium Corporation of America, also known as Lithco. So with one buyer and two producers, there was zero risk of lithium running out. Still, the US government used every trick in the playbook to control production and trade in lithium. Outside of military use, lithium had a lot of potential, and I emphasize that it was all potential, not reality. For example, this image is a cover from the 1955 annual report of Lithco, and it shows these potential uses, which are very similar to today. Nuclear power, batteries, pharmaceuticals, multipurpose greases, etc. So Lithgow and Foote at the time built huge research and development labs to find new uses for lithium. So to get new industries to use lithium, they needed not only a good product, but also the promise of reliable and cheap future supplies of lithium. And so they invested also very much in exploration, even though they could barely sell what they already produced. And so between US trade controls and Lithgow and Foote's race to keep up the promise of a reliable supply, expanding mining with very little regard to equity or justice was the priority, all for very speculative uses. Jumping ahead to the 1960s, electric cars with lithium-ion batteries also had a big moment. And this image here is from Foote's magazine in 1967. And I love it because it has so much what we still talk about today. Flying taxis, electrified roads, and essentially car sharing. Just a few years later, in 1970, the LA Times reported, quote, electric autos could revive Ghost Town in reference to Silver Peak. And so as you already know, the town was not revived on the terms that this journalist imagined. So to close this section of my talk, mining memories are a useful analytical tool for examining the aspirations different groups have pinned on minerals. These memories are affective and empirical, and they are backward and forward looking. And so the history of lithium trading sheds a particularly bright light on the power of fears of mineral shortages and of hopes for clean and infinite energy. And to be perfectly honest with you, after all of this research, I am still left wondering why, as a society, do we fear mineral scarcity so much when, in fact, shortages have been so rare? And despite these recurrent fears, there has always been plenty of lithium. In fact, too much of it, by Foote's and Lithgow's own comments and assertions for time and time again. They were always complaining there was too much lithium on the market. And so this is where I turn to geological and mining science, which played a really large role in sustaining this fear of a shortage through various fictions about this particular nature that they created and sustained. So for example, there was a lot of secrecy and disagreement over how to quantify reserves in salt flats. There was selective ignorance of the effects of pumping on the brines and the salt flats and how the brines might behave if they leaked or were re-injected. And there were also very narrow ideas about the water cycle in these deserts. So in all the correspondence, so 40 years of correspondence between the Foote Company, the Leprechaun Company, U.S. Geological Society, and their Chilean partners, questions about water and the life that depends on it rarely come up. And I find this really surprising because as this photo that's from around 1975, taken in the Atacama salt flat, helps to illustrate, it was pretty evident that this was a massive water operation in what was already well known to be the world's driest desert. So at the time, one of Foote's men, probably the geologist that you see pictured here with his back towards us, he described the salt flat as, quote, a lake of lithium waiting to be tapped. So after years of careful studies, and despite calling it a lake, this same geologist went ahead and split this liquid mine in two, as if different wells weren't drawing from exactly the same source. So after years of working on the Salar, he had just a few hours to draw a line on the salt crust to demarcate one investment from another one, as if underground brine flows respect property boundaries. And so this is one example of many where separation built on fictions about nature was necessary for lithium production to proceed. So for salt flats to become working mines, lithium had to be separated from potassium, value had to be separated from waste, and liquid mines had to be split And these separations all had to succeed in nature, in law, and in markets. This was no easy task, and it mirrors the fragmentation of nature into its component parts that is emblematic of mechanistic science. So mechanistic science, what is this? Mechanistic science seeks to explain the whole by identifying its component parts and their relationships with each other. And I build on Carolyn Merchant's seminal critique of mechanistic science, where she argued mechanistic science both rendered nature dead and, quote, as a female to be controlled and dissected through experiment, which then legitimated the exploitation of natural resources. And so my use of the term living minerals really comes from Carolyn Merchant's 1980 book, The Death of Nature. And in this preface, in the preface to this recent edition of the book, she describes camping in the Utah desert and realizing that, quote, science viewed the desert rocks as dead and inert, yet for much of human history, those very rocks had been alive, growing and reproducing like plants and animals. So how then to see nature differently? To see it as alive rather than as inert, appropriable, and separable into component parts that relate to each other like cogs in a machine. So it's the salt flats that helped me see things differently. I hope you remember our ancestors that I mentioned earlier, the microbes who live in salt flats, producing ozone and oxygen. So the Likanantai have a special name for these microbial mats, which you see pictured here. They call them living rocks because they may look and feel like rocks, but they are actually breathing and reproducing forms of life. So as a paradigm, living minerals asks us to pay attention not only to scientific representations of nature, but also to mining memories. Important as they have been and continue to be, scientific representations of nature are rooted in cultural, political, and economic commitments, which have often positioned scientists as allies or even the vanguard of global capitalism and colonialism. This is illustrated particularly well by the history of mineral trading between the United States and Chile. Now, how to represent nature matters a lot, not just for understanding the past, but also in new legal systems that recognize that humans are part of the Earth's living systems and that challenge traditional legal models that treat nature as property. This includes rights of nature laws, which are part of a movement towards ecological jurisprudence. And so you can see in this graph a huge increase in ecological jurisprudence in the last decade, thanks to the hard work of many environmental justice movements across the world. Now, rights of nature, which is essentially three basic rights, if we keep it simple: the right to exist, the right to flourish, and the right to regenerate. It poses in law the problem of who speaks for nature in courts of law. And scholars are increasingly turning to scientists as the privileged spokespersons of nature. As the history of lithium mining shows, however, and as I hope to have, helped convince you today, it would be a really grave mistake to leave this to the scientists alone. Hence the importance of mining memories and other forms of storytelling to reflect on our past and our future. So some closing reflections. So living minerals as a paradigm is based on plural forms of knowledge, ecological jurisprudence, and historical narratives that recenter life. Many of these things are not new. A lot of scholars have been writing about these things for a long time, and particularly Indigenous leaders have been talking about them for a long time. But they haven't had the influence that we need them to have in order to really advance climate equity and justice. By contrast, old ideas of minerals as strategic are rooted in mechanistic science and resource nationalism. In the United States, Resource nationalism is rooted in hopes of military power and achieving infinite clean and cheap energy through nuclear power, for example, and in really unfounded fears of mineral shortages that might erode the United States' power. In the book, I also describe Chile's version of resource nationalism, which is rooted in a sense of frustrated development, where the nation has not benefited as it should from mineral resources. In either case, resource nationalism works to erase alternative modes of being and thinking across multiple levels, including the microbial. Thank you. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. A really fantastic presentation, putting a number of literatures and social processes and movements into conversation with each other through this lens of lithium. So thank you very much. That was really engaging. There's a lot of material to work with. And I'll hand over the floor to Craig, who has the first stab at it. And I know there's lots of interesting things to engage with that others would like to bring after Craig. But Craig, if I can call on you to offer some comments, that'd be great. Thank you so much, Javiera. Oh, Craig, you're there. You're on mute, Craig.
Hi, sorry. Of all the times for my the Wi-Fi here to stop working, it was just now. So just give me a second. I'm moving rooms, and I'm just getting set up again. Okay. Hi, everyone. Fingers crossed that my Wi-Fi connection. No. Sorry.
No necesitamos eso. Solamente está usando el wifi acá.
El vaso de
El vaso es de ustedes, creo.
Ah,
O la otra persona.
bueno.
Gracias.
Okay. The joys of multitasking. Okay. Well, thank you, Javiera, for such a wonderful presentation. And as you said, we've been working together for over half a decade now. And so I've seen parts of your journey. I know you've towards the end of the book project, you were sort of I think thinking quite hopefully about a life beyond this current project. But I think I also got the sense of how much love and effort and time you put into this truly remarkable piece of work. So my plan for right now is to just speak really briefly, perhaps just picking up on a few observations and things that spoke to me. And then I've got a few questions, I think, just to kind of provoke maybe some further discussion among the group, but also perhaps to kind of connect some of the insights that I took from your book and connect them with some of the things that are happening right now. And as you mentioned in the talk, it's striking how contemporary some of these narratives still remain. Just a question: is it noisy? Is the noise in the background affecting? Okay, we're good. All right. Okay, so as Javiera mentioned, the book is downloadable, and I would strongly recommend getting a copy and having a look at the content, because I think it's impossible to summarize all of the richness and everything that's in the book. And I'll do my best to just sort of highlight some of the things that I took away. But really, I think there's just so much rich material in there that really adds to our understanding of both the contemporary energy transition, but also the way in which capital maneuvers itself and the kinds of power plays, to borrow your phrase, that we see happening that have led to these consolidations of new extractive frontiers. I think my first general comment, and the thing I really like about the book, is that you're coming at the question of extractivism and the current boom and demand for lithium from an indigenous and feminist and rights of nature perspective. And I think that's important because I agree that most of the conversations that are going on, certainly at, let's call them, high levels of policy discourse right now in North America and Western Europe, but also I was at PDAC a week and a half ago in that conference that brings together governments and financiers and mining companies and consultants. It's pretty hard. You're pretty hard pressed to find any legitimate or serious concern about the environment, and so I think your argument that we need to see a shift away from resource nationalism is an important position that you're taking, and one that I think also speaks to some of the people here online today and I'm one of them. Like, we certainly have an interest in resource nationalism, but I think your book highlights kind of the ecological implications of embracing resource nationalism without having some paradigm or framework or institutional capacity to govern the ecological impacts of accelerated extractivism. I love the concept of ontological fluidity. I felt that you did a great job of just representing it on the page there. And I won't go into detail here, but in the book too, you really use the concept well to look at both the ways in which companies and geologists represent the value of or the availability of lithium, but also the way in which markets treat it, and the way in which governments regulate it. Is it a mineral? Is it water? And you've got this really fascinating discussion too on the Chilean context regarding the ways in which Foot Minerals was kind of exercising power and negotiating with Corfu and the Chilean state to establish Atacama as a lithium extraction zone. And I think many of us will know about the special designation that continues to still define who can extract from that part of Chile. Same with mining memories. Like, for me, it's a really interesting way of thinking about how institutional path dependencies get created and constructed by particular ideas and narratives and imaginaries that you document in the work. And then exhaustion, there too, I think this is something that doesn't get discussed as much, is kind of how and when will the lithium reserves that are currently being exploited in South America, for instance, how and when will they run out? I think I love the fact that you use the metaphor of an Olympic-sized swimming pool to illustrate the sheer scale of extraction that's been going on. And just today or just yesterday in the workshop I was mentioning here in Susques, people were asking about that, like how much water has been lost, in this case from Argentina as a result of lithium mining. And there too, that as you point out in the book, the science is both not often clear, but also it's hidden and it's obscured in the context of a boom and bust dynamic. Just want to pick up on a few of the critiques that you're making that I think, again, are worth highlighting. For sure, the critique of the contemporary extractivist model, I think, is something that I take away from your analysis. And I love the way that you both situate the consolidation of lithium extraction in California, Nevada, and Atacama with different commodities. And so looking at, and use values too, looking at how lithium was first being exploited for its use value in relation to fusion, and how this changes over time, and how it, as you mentioned in the talk, how that restricts and attracts different kinds of power plays where the U.S. government is the only buyer, and you've got these two sellers. Things have changed a lot in the contemporary context. We've got a different monopsony now with China, but still to this day, the number of companies actually selling lithium is pretty limited, and that affects, I think, the power that we see in the market. Your critique of science too. I won't get into the details on how scientists, how geologists and engineers were kind of experimenting with and defining and trying to understand the properties of different salares and salt flats. The one thing I really took away from it was this conflict between the USGS and the companies, and again, that's something too that hasn't really disappeared. That we still see discussions going on about the lack of transparency between companies and communities, or companies and government. And so I took a lot from that discussion of how the USGS at this point in time anyway was erring towards being more conservative, and it was a struggle with the company, with Foot Minerals and with others. Okay, just trying to read my notes here. My apologies. Yeah, the last really big critique that I would highlight in my commentary today would be the more general critique you're raising about the kind of green economy that's being imagined for resolving the climate crisis. And I wrote in my notes here the idea that the model we're currently pursuing, and the one that you described, the one whose origins you describe in the book, is effectively consuming our way out of the climate crisis and orienting production now towards electric vehicles when, as we know, there are many alternative perspectives on how the electrification of transportation, for instance, could better be applied. And one of my favorite quotes from the book, in thinking about what's being lost through this process, is when you say, what will be remembered as life becomes extinct? And that's how, like, sitting here in northern Argentina, that's the feeling I get is you've got this race, this scramble to secure and to produce more and more lithium. And I keep wondering, what will we think about 20, 30 years from now when we look back on the decisions that were made or weren't made during that critical transition? And your book, I think, offers a lot of conceptual material that we can use to think about those questions, but also obviously a really important historical analog, a historical experience that should continue to inform our understanding of lithium, in large part because many of the actors are still the same. Okay, so those are my general comments just on the book and the analysis. A few questions, I think, just to kind of provoke any responses that you feel like giving them or further discussion. As I mentioned, it's like most of my work on lithium is in the contemporary era. And so for me, reading your book, it just raised all these questions about what we're seeing today. My first question would be whether we've really improved at all in terms of producing reliable information and data on the quality of reserves versus resources in geological deposits. And I would add to that too, have we improved at all in collecting data or establishing knowledge on the ecological foundations of living minerals that exist within these extractive zones? And I don't know if Chile might offer a bit more reason for optimism than other contexts that we're working in. But that's my first question. The second would be whether you can offer any insights about the kinds of consolidation we're seeing today in the lithium market. And so this takes you a little bit further away from what you're doing in the book, but I think the points of analysis are very instructive to what we're seeing now. But the arrival of some of the really big mining firms like Rio Tinto in both Chile and Argentina now, like, do you have any reflections on kind of whether we're moving into like a new phase of hyper extraction and hyper capitalist mobilization, or is this subject to some of the same kind of back and forth dynamics you talk about in the book? And finally, as someone who's done a lot of work on Ecuador, I can't hesitate, or I can't. I'm interested in your thoughts on, I guess, the applicability of rights of nature, because I agree with you. It offers a really important alternative paradigm to the extractivist model. But as we know, in Ecuador itself, the government has used rights of nature to push small-scale miners out of areas to clear the way for industrial mining. So I guess, like, pushing you to say a little bit more about the viability that you see right now, either in Latin America or in the US context too. It would be interesting to hear your reflections about how far rights of nature can take us right now in this very polarized context that we're living in right now. So I'll stop there. Look forward to hearing responses and discussions with the group. And again, I really love the book, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks so much, Craig, for the thoughtful comments and the initial questions. Should we dive right in? Javier, would you like to respond? And then after, I'll open up the floor.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to answer your three questions, which are sort of all very excellent and difficult. I don't have clean answers, but I'll keep it short so we can open it up to Q&A. So, and thank you, Craig, for not just your support today and your wonderful comments, but now so many years of working together on this, because being part of the Sherka group has been really enriching for me and helping me sort of keep abreast of these sort of more contemporary dynamics and be thinking about them from more current contemporary and political economy and regulatory perspective. So it has really been a fundamental collaboration for me. So to your first question, have we improved at all in producing reliable information about nature, collecting data on sort of all these ecological foundations? I think the short answer, I would say, is no. But we do have so much more data and so many more tools for democratizing and expanding the possibilities of creating data. And we are seeing this, right? So we're seeing indigenous communities use the money that they're getting from the mining companies to do their own monitoring. And so therefore to be able to participate with their own voice and with their own sort of control in some of these processes. So that, I think, is so there's some things like that which are really great, moves forward, signs of progress. But at the same time, I think we have, and the other big sign of progress, I think, is that we have an increasingly diverse scientific community that is just much more diverse than it was, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And with that comes greater capacity for self-reflection, which includes, so a lot of scientists becoming climate activists, becoming outspoken allies of, environmental groups, of community groups, participating in citizen science. And so that's also absolutely fundamental, right? Expanding and growing the support that scientists that are doing that hard work receive, and the recognition that they receive, often they still face really strong headwinds from within the scientific community, from their own peers, and they're often really punished professionally for taking those stands and for doing that kind of work. So, really a lot of respect and a big shout out to them. I think the main there's a risk of drowning in too much data, right? So this is part of what I describe in my first book of this creation of like a marketplace for data, and where it's just, the person, the group with the most money produces the most data, and that becomes the most authoritative account of what exists. And we have this erosion of the democratic and institutional structures in place that existed to validate data and to create authoritative narratives or analyses of the world or statistics of the world, right? And I think that we have a deepening of that process globally. So we have a deepening of the privatization of science, a deepening of the privatization of data. And this is another big front in the current wars around, data centers and undersea cables and data sovereignty, data surveillance, data control. And I think we need to, this is a little bit beyond my depth and scope right now, but it's part of what I'm increasingly thinking about too, in terms of, those mechanisms in place for validating data as data becomes, as we move, we're in the era of big data, and all the pros and cons of that. So it's a difficult question to answer. There has been some improvements, and there has also kind of a changing and I think larger scale kind of challenges than we've had in the past. Second question was about the consolidation that we're seeing today, sort of the arrival of Rio Tinto, such a, no, is that I'm not very optimistic. Rio Tinto is probably amongst the mining companies with the worst reputation globally, in terms of its impacts, environmental impacts, its relationship with communities, everything. So it's not a very inspiring move. Part of what I discuss in the book is these historical cycles between who invests in the lithium mines, right? So at some points we had these sort of specialized companies, and even Albemarle is these specialized chemistry companies that have a lot of know-how and expertise versus like Newmont and these sort of big hedge fund mineral investment groups that are kind of generalists, and they just put money down and then they sell when things don't look so great to them. I think Rio Tinto is in this category. It's a mining company, but they're kind of just a generalist and they do it all. And I don't know that they'll have the stomach, the patience for the long-term work that it takes to develop lithium mines. I think one thing that hasn't changed is that lithium mining is hard because lithium is really ontologically fluid. It's just a very, kind of like the Wile E. Coyote. It's just a crazy mineral that does all kinds of different things and is really difficult to work with. And so it still takes 10 years, to build a brine lithium mine. And that hasn't really changed. And so I think it takes that expertise, and it takes a company that's really willing to put in the work. And that's what's interesting about looking at the history of the Foot Mineral Company. They always resisted this pressure to be extracting other products alongside lithium, and sort of said, no, 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 we just want to focus on the lithium. And I think there was an element of saying that's what we want to do because we know this is going to be hard work, that you can't just show up and do it overnight. So I still remain very skeptical about the speed with which this flurry of investment is going to lead to new productive mines. And of course, that's something that makes me happy. But so I might just be kidding myself and being kind of optimistic here that it's a long time from breaking ground to actually producing. So we will see. I think it is important. I think one thing that as scholars, I think is important is that we become more precise in how we characterize these companies, right? And you know, a lot of these lithium companies, they're not oil companies. These are not Shells and Chevrons that are the world's biggest, most overcapitalized companies, right? A lot of these are really, some of these are small companies, you know, relatively speaking. And so I think we need to just be a little bit more fine-grained in how we describe the sector. I know in Canada is again just the center of the world for this and just kind of understanding. This was part of my original intention that I really wasn't able to do to just understand better the Toronto Stock Exchange and sort of the financing reforms that happened, and sort of how Canadian financing works to help sort of support all of these startups that have now, you know, the Leprechaun company has now been replaced by this very global cast of characters of these junior companies that are really, you know, unaffiliated to place, right? That are just don't have that kind of long-term commitment like the Leprechaun company had. And then finally, applicability of rights of nature. Of course, every time I give these talks to a South American audience, everyone is completely skeptical and jaded and, you know, traumatized, I think, by the ways in which rights of nature has not worked. I try to emphasize the more positive ways in which rights of nature is working. And, you know, Ecuador, we can read the record in both ways. Yes, there have been some devastating decisions and measures. There have also been some incredible decisions, and the steps taken, right? Of, you know, the military being used to remove illegal mining, like, you know, remove private property. That to me is a big deal. How far can it take us? I think part of what I want to think about and work on next is and part of what this book is also sort of aiming towards is taking rights of nature out of the courts of law. It cannot just be a legal doctrine. And so how do we integrate rights of nature into, you know, all aspects of our work? And how do we begin to practice and live a rights of nature world, even where we don't have rights of nature on the legal books? And so that's why I think that ecological jurisprudence framework is good. You know, I kind of adopted it sort of late after I really finished writing the book because it helps to put rights of nature sort of in a somewhat broader context of a set of legal changes that are happening. And so this to me is, you know, this is a work in progress, and we're learning, and Ecuador is, you know, an early, you know, on the vanguard, really. So of course, it hasn't been perfect, but nothing is. And these are really powerful and entrenched, you know, sets of actors that rights of nature is being asked to counter. So, um, you know, we should be modest, or not modest, but, you know, we should not forget that. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that comprehensive set of answers to some very good questions. Alex has raised an issue in the text. Alex, would you like to address it directly by intervening on the floor?
Sure, sure. I think sort of there's some people that are interested in resource nationalism and its discussion in your text. So I thought, first of all, I'd like to say, Javiera, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Thank you, Craig, as well, for a wonderful set of discussion questions and comments. Really informative. I look forward to reading the book after having seen the presentation. From what I gather, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Javiera, your analysis aligns with the Latin American scholarly critique of what these scholars have termed neo-extractivism. And I would agree that the resource nationalist perspective, following their argument, has largely ignored indigenous and communal rights environmental concerns and the rights of nature. However, neo-extractivism or real resource nationalism in Latin America also ushered significant social redistribution in the 2010s. I think of Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, using mineral and extractive revenues to fund social programs. So I wonder, with the recent rightward turn of many Latin American governments, I wonder if resource nationalism is the appropriate strawman or target for left-wing academics and activists, or perhaps is the process of resource extraction in and of itself, which is the central problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the arguments that I sort of try to emphasize in the book is that, looking at the case of Chile, which is really what I focus on in terms of Latin American countries, all governments, left and right, have been pro-mining. And they have all used different versions of resource nationalism to advance their goals. So right-wing governments also, the military dictatorship ratified the nationalization of copper. It was really under the democratic governments after 1990 that part of the lithium complex was privatized, not by changing the basic structure, but by selling the public company that was sort of the joint venture partner on the lithium projects, and by privatizing SQM, which was until that point a public company. Basically there's all these hybrids, right? And it's not this like just one extreme or another of totally the state or totally private. And I think the history of lithium mining in Chile really helps to illustrate, in a way, that flexibility, that ideological flexibility within that constancy. All governments have been pro mining and pro extractivism in that sense. And and part of what I argue, and you might be interested, chapter 5 in particular, is the ways in which the neoliberal, there was a big debate, a really interesting debate in the early 1980s around the lithium mines, which allows us to see the ways in which the neoliberal generals and allied with neoliberal economists, they embraced a form of extractivism as mining without industrialization. Until then, the goal of every government in Chile always, which is also what we see in a lot of Bolivia's extractivism, was to industrialize, right? To use mining revenues to industrialize, and that's what would modernize the economy and put them on a different development trajectory. It's the neoliberals that abandon the industrialization goals. And so that really is what becomes the split. Not mining, no mining, not the environment. They were all, unconcerned about the environment, but, industrialization and who would lead it. Or if it was even a topic for the neoliberals, it wasn't. And so this right-wing turn, I think, is just going to, from the point of view of extractivism, will just bring, in a sense, more of the same. It will, mining will continue as it has under left-wing governments, and the question will be who exactly will benefit and how, but it's, in a sense, it's a kind of, in the case of Chile, at least, it's almost, I don't expect the right-wing government to really succeed in changing things too much. The lithium framework has been ratified again and again, validated again and again by every government that has come in. Again, the technological, ontological fluidity challenges that lithium poses makes it really difficult to actually operate with, unless we see a major, major breakthrough in direct lithium extraction technologies that make it really easy to come in and extract from very small deposits. I don't think we're going to see even the technical possibilities for any kind of real change. So in that sense, for the case of Chile, I'm not that worried. I think the case of Argentina is perhaps a more interesting one to think about, the ways in which Milei has or has not really changed things on the ground. But Craig, and it's complicated, so I don't want to venture into that. But yeah, I think overall, I don't expect as much change as we think there could be. I also think that in a lot of these countries, the social movements and the demands from the ground for some form of redistribution, for some form of benefit sharing, I think those networks are pretty robust. And I don't think, the Bolivian communities, the Chilean communities in the Atacama, they're not going to just roll over and let the government come in with, some new private company and do whatever they want. Like they haven't done it in the past. I don't think they're going to change now. And so they think they're going to, on the ground, still really be forced to either we'll see a lot of repression, and which is perhaps what we've seen in Argentina. But I think that, in that sense, Bolivians in particular have been very effective at toppling governments. They've done it in the past. They will do it again. And I don't think that in Chile, the laws and the institutions and the legality of the system is so rigid that I don't see major changes.
Great, thank you. Could we have some more questions, please, from the floor? Would anybody put their hand up or enter a question in the chat?
You have a question there, Richard, from Ezra.
Oh, I didn't see it.
It's in the chat.
Oh, okay. Ezra, would you like to ask a question, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I cannot come on camera right now, but I'm happy to vocalize the question I pose on the chat. Thank you very much for this fantastic presentation. Provided me a lot of food for further thought. And I'm especially impressed by your, understanding and theoretical richness of the concept that you use, the mechanistic science, especially within the context of resource extraction, and particularly the idea that frames nature as inert subject to control, much like the historical treatment of the female body, as just you mentioned. And this resonates a lot with my current research, and I'm looking at the accelerated exploration and extraction of critical minerals through the technologies such as AI. And many of these technologies are often framed as scientifically authoritative solutions. And these technologies are also being deployed in South America, where AI and automation is promoted as tools for most sustainable and ethical mineral sourcing, just to address long-standing environmental issues that we have. So I was wondering how you perceive the role of these kind of technological fixes within your own theoretical framework, and how they might be further explored through the living minerals perspective. Thank you so much.
Wow. I'm looking forward to reading your research, Ezra. I think that I don't know a lot about how the AI and the automation tools are being used, and I would love to actually hear more. If they're being used in lithium in particular, I know in copper mining, right? There's been a big move and shift towards automation and AI things. And I think that, again, as scholars, sort of really looking at sort of, labor, questions of labor that take into account this automation turn are really fundamental. I think one of the things that's interesting about lithium, perhaps, is that as far as I can tell, the labor requirements are very small. And so it hasn't raised a lot of the historical and traditional questions around mining, where labor is a big issue. And so from that perspective, the question of automation sort of changes a little bit. One area, and so this is taking me into some of the Sherca-founded research I've been doing in another part of Chile, the Maricunga salt flat. What we're finding there with my collaborator, Nushi Golris, is sort of this imaginary of the automated direct lithium extraction lab that's modular. And so this imaginary that you can arrive in this very high altitude remote place, you build this little self-contained lab that's almost like a little, like a little container. It's very small and light and contained, and then you extract, you pump it all out, you empty out the brine, you re-inject the brine, and there's so many questions around that. It's, just that's a different question that I'm happy to talk about. you re-inject the brine, and then you dismantle the lab. And so I think that the AI and automation turn, the technological fixes as you're proposing them here, it helps to further advance that imaginary that we can now do mining without leaving a permanent footprint, right? And then this modular lab will then be dismantled and disappear, and then the tourists can go back to the salt flat as if nothing ever happened here. And it's just, it's obviously such a lie. It's such a complete lie. But I think that's part of what we're seeing. And so these units also, they're automated in the sense that they're all computer controlled from the city. And so you can have this like little container ship that goes to 5,000 meters above sea level, where the oxygen is really quite light. And so it's hard to work there. And it can all be controlled by computers, somewhere else. And so those are some of the trends that we're seeing. And so in that sense, the AI and the automation is just sort of advancing that imaginary of mining as if it was this clean enterprise, when really what this is all doing is expanding the mineral frontier, increasing mining. So in the name of efficiency, in the name of, a better mode of production, well, all we have at the end of the day is always more and more and more production, more and more mining, and we're just locked into more and more mining.
If I could add to that just really quickly, that's a really good point you're making, Javiera, and a fantastic question, Ezra. I think there's a downstream connection too to AI in the sense that in the last few years, as the market for EV has dipped a little bit because of China removing its subsidies and then the end of the IRA and EV fatigue maybe in some of the Western economies, companies are now shifting and putting more money into data centers, and data centers are now using a lot more, are purchasing more battery technology to store and produce data. And I think again it comes back to your question, Javiera, about what is the use of like what is the end goal of what we're pursuing here, and does the world really need more data centers, I guess, and what impact does it have in places like Atacama? Yeah, Windsor, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly on technological fixes, since so many of you here are in Canada, but Sean Johnston, just has a really great, very clear book on technological fixes, which is what I draw from in the book. And yeah, it's a great volume, and also really good for teaching with Montreal University Press. I think maybe McGill University Press. I think it must be McGill University Press. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Ezra, you had a follow-up comment?
Yeah, just a comment on the AI data centers, because I believe that this receives a lot of community resistance in South America, not only in South America, but in Southern Africa as well, because of the forceful, land enclosures and the environmental footprint that these systems have in place. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and also here in California. So we have data centers just going up in some of the hottest places in the desert. So it's madness. And I think, to what Craig was describing, I think it's a investment boom. It's all these companies with too much money. They don't know what to do with it. And so they found this as a great real estate business. They can take control of land, take control of waters, and sort of just capitalize on these cheap minerals, to build these places just in case, it's just sort of investments, after they've already exhausted the real estate investments, and there's only so many empty apartment buildings and things they can own around the world. And so now this is the next frontier. But yeah, Chilean communities and Californian communities, it's a global onslaught, really.
Interesting. If I could ask a question, and it's really to draw a contrast in some ways between the kinds of things you've been talking about around brine lithium extraction and the kinds of resistance and the contesting imaginaries and what we experience here, which is quite different. Also lithium, even lithium in Zimbabwe has a long history back to 1951. The major mine, Africa's largest lithium mine, has been there since 51. It's now being explored. There's a lot of literature and research around the process of embedding lithium in the Ghanaian economy alongside recent discoveries of oil and gas. And we haven't talked about lithium in the usual suspects of Zambia, DRC, maybe even Mozambique. So there's a different kind of tone to it, and it's mixed with a recent wave of resource nationalism, which you also touched upon. And some of our arguments, and Alex and others in the AEGT, we were in a previous partnership on the return of resource nationalism to Southern Africa. And it was trying to understand what was driving this wave, a new kind of wave of resource nationalism in the 2000s in the wake of the commodity supercycle. And I think we more or less came to the conclusion, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, on behalf of other people in the partnership, came to the conclusion that this was something which is actually originated from below, not from elites. Some elites had reconciled themselves in some ways with neoliberalism and extracting profits and private accumulation in other ways. Illicit. They were definitely part of illicit financial transfers and secret joint venture deals and what have you. And what we saw in the wake of the supercycle was a push from below for a better deal. And it wasn't just smash and grab and nationalization. It was development of spillovers, employment, redistribution of new forms of taxation, royalties, kind of a broader industrial policy, if you want, which also included small-scale mining. So it's a kind of a different recent lineage of resource nationalism here, which remains there as it was absorbed and manipulated by elites, partly to regain and retain legitimacy. And some of the policy interventions were not very productive in the end, but it nonetheless remains as a tool by which one can try to discipline companies and elites as well, and hold them accountable. So it's a different kind of lineage, a different kind of origin in the current period. And that brings us to lithium in Zimbabwe, where it's not Western companies, it's Chinese miners effectively, and trading assets amongst themselves in rotation in a way in which it makes it very difficult to collect data, basic data, on what actually ore grades are and what's being produced and what's being exported. One of the responses to that in Zimbabwe, and I'd like to hear your views on this, is an announcement out of the blue some weeks ago that there would be a ban on all on-processed lithium ores from Zimbabwe, and 99% of it is produced by Chinese companies. And there are obviously close diplomatic and economic links between this government and the Chinese government. So what do we make of efforts to force some wider and more accountable degree of beneficiation from lithium? What has been the Chilean experience, for example, in that regard? What do Zimbabwean civil society groups, which have said yes to the ban without really understanding the details of the industry and the processes of beneficiation at different scales of value addition, what do you think is the way forward in the kinds of politics which is what is on the plate now? Here in Zimbabwe, in terms of lithium bans, limited community participation, and really a stranglehold on extraction and processing by a few firms from China.
And so to make sure I understood correctly, the ban is on the export of unprocessed lithium
Correct.
ore? Yeah.
Correct, yeah.
That's fascinating because we have the same thing in Chile.
Yeah.
Brine cannot be exported, and brine is, tightly controlled by the nuclear agency in Chile. And this is sort of a throwback to the laws that I analyze, how they came to be in the book. And I think we've seen sort of similar things and discussions even here in California, um, with these sort of like origin requirements and things like that. They're all aimed at sort of banning the trade in unprocessed things. And so in Chile, as you know, as I guess as I was saying, the origin of it comes from the nuclearity that lithium had. And so this idea that, part of the tug of war in Chilean law and policy during the 70s and 80s was between sort of the nuclear agency and the mining ministry, who wanted to safeguard brine reserves for future generations because they didn't want the lithium to run out today and be wasted on what they saw as useless things. They wanted to be sure that there would be enough lithium for the future when nuclear fusion would be powering society and when lithium would really be critical and strategic and important. And so that's part of why there was this, 2 decades worth of negotiations between them to figure out what kind of structure to put in place that would allow the Chilean state to sort of retain control over the brines and what they called the reserves or the deposits, but still allow some level of extraction and production. And so that, that kind of tug of war continues to this day. And so it's really fascinating to see it being reproduced, or echoes of it, and ideas of, because we don't have such bans for like, copper ore. I'm assuming Zimbabwe has not had these conversations over copper, even though that's also a major mineral commodity there, or has it?
No, but they have had it over platinum, and they're a
Oh,
major world producer of platinum, which is
okay.
also a critical
Okay.
mineral. But I mean,
Interesting.
and it's a kind of a similar situation in terms of the cost of beneficiation. You need electricity, chemical inputs, factories,
Yeah.
none of which we have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do that on a competitive basis for an international market. The same holds true for platinum. What
Right.
happens in platinum in Zimbabwe is the company exports to its parent company in South Africa, economies of scale, and they refine it there. Platinum mining is very expensive to refine. So what
Yeah.
they've done in Zimbabwe is say no export of platinum concentrate. And of
Right.
course, it's impossible. It's more than $1 billion to build a refinery for which you don't have the
Yeah.
electricity.
Yeah.
So it's a precursor to asking for windfall taxes,
Right. Right.
which is what's happened in the past in a cyclical
Yeah.
fashion.
Yeah.
And I expect that's what's going to happen here. Or maybe I'm wrong. Uh, what do the next steps of processing
Yeah.
beyond lithium carbonate or sulfate look like? What does it look like? And how much, I mean, how much needs to be invested in that? And is it an employment and tax
Yeah.
creation process? Because this is obviously what they're looking for. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that, given what you've seen in
Yeah.
Latin America.
It's again, similar debates have happened in Chile where some people say, oh, we need to process it here, but then others say we don't have the electricity. The electricity is too expensive. We don't have the water, da 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 da. Who would do that? And so in this last 4 years, the current government, but I think this was also dragging on from the prior right-wing government, which goes back to the earlier question. I think the changes between the governments have been less in practice than some of the posturing would suggest. So they put in this sort of, it kind of carve out in a way precisely to get the, Chinese were the only ones that expressed interest. So BYD was supposed to open and build this huge refining and battery facility and da 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 as, part of all these like, tax breaks that they would get and preferential treatments. And then they pulled out at the last minute. The whole thing fell apart, and they didn't. They aborted the whole project. I should know more about the details of exactly. I can't remember now exactly how and why that all happened. This was, but this was all. It fell apart about 2 or 3 years ago, so it was in the recent kind of moment. So the short story is that, in Chile, these debates have been going on since the 1960s, and still the refining and processing capacity and the battery construction capacity is still in its total infancy. Right. And so the only refining capacity that you have is owned by the two lithium companies that have been operating since the 1980s. Both of them sort of took over old nitrate facilities that existed and converted those into lithium carbonate pot processing. And then they export the lithium carbonate for further processing, in the case of Albemarle to the United States and to their other sort of European and global facilities. In the case of SQM, they sort of sell it, I think, directly to like Tesla and battery and car manufacturers who will then, I guess, have their sources and stuff. I think the lithium metal production has increased, but again, within it's sort of additional investment by those two companies within their existing facility. So they've sort of opened up kind of an extra, built like an extra facility. So that's what's really like that's where the production is and what has actually happened. And so the new research in Maricunga, which is interesting, because this is all still kind of experimental pilot facilities. This is not industrial production by any means, and we have a long way to go before we get there. But what we were seeing there with Nushi in our research with these direct lithium extraction labs is that they're increasingly bringing brines to the lab, right? And so there's this growing trade in brines. And because Argentinian brine, that can be exported, there's no controls because not just Milei, but before Milei, there was kind of really very little control to Argentinian lithium mining, and the state was pretty much kind of all go, go, go. And so they're exporting the Argentinian brine, bringing it to Chile, running it through these small DLE labs to see like kind of where's a match. Which DLE filtration technology works well with which brine. And so we were walking through some of these where you just had all these buckets labeled with the names of different salt flats as they're sort of running these processes. The Chilean regulators I know from my interviews with them, like this is the stuff of their nightmares. They are sort of obsessed with concern of Chilean brines being stolen and trafficked. And so that's where a lot of their attention and concern and fear goes. And how do we continue to kind of control and safeguard our brines and make sure that the brine isn't being exported? Yeah. Similar concerns. It's been very slow going to actually produce new industries in Chile.
Yeah, I guess if I could just respond, the one big question that's emerging here is, do these Chinese lithium extractors who are linked back into processing in China, are they somehow different than a standard Western extractivist company in the sense that there might be some resource trade-offs or swaps around technology and
Right.
and I was just wondering if you'd seen any evidence of that in Chile or Argentina.
Yeah, so China's a really recent actor in Chile. I think the way a lot of people have described it to me in the Chilean industry and mining sector is that in a way China arrived late when, Chilean mining was already really saturated with, Canadian, Australian, US, and Chilean capital and Korean capital. And so there was just in a way kind of they arrived and there was no room. Um, and and so they haven't, they don't have the presence that they have in other South American countries. I think there's also a lot of racism, prejudice, distrust, dislike and so a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment um, because, like it or not, in the DLE sector, they really seem to have the knowledge, right? The technology and the expertise. And as one interviewer put it to me, in China, they have buildings with 2,000 PhDs that are working on this, right? They're going to figure it out sooner rather than later, and just no one else has put that level of attention to it. So yeah, I think people think and assume that the treatment and the relationship is very different, but it's not something that is sort of really tried and tested in the Chilean case.
Alex, have you got any further chats or questions to add?
I think maybe the last question for the session, if time permits, from Emily. Emily, I can read it on your behalf, or you could equally read it or present it yourself if you wish.
Yeah, sure, I can read it. Thank you so much, Javiera, for that presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I loved reading your book. And one of the themes I really appreciated in your book was your discussion of market assemblages and the speculative nature of lithium markets, especially the way these markets are sort of artificially shaped through financial systems and narratives of urgency. And that got me thinking a lot about the history of oil, particularly in 1971 when President Nixon ended the gold standard and made the US dollar fiat currency. So I think that ties well to your discussion about how the financial system is very speculative, very manufactured, very artificial. So I'm curious. And then a few years after 1971, after he did that, with the rise of the petrodollar system, there's this interesting connection, which you also touch on, between energy and the financial system. So I'm interested in what parallels you see between the economy and financial system that emerged around oil and now the current one that's emerging around lithium. And I mean, connecting to your discussion you just had with Richard, maybe this new one could be more multipolar. So I was wondering what similarities and differences you potentially see.
Thanks, Emily. It's nice to see you. That's a great question, and it's such a great global studies question. So thank you for that. These are kinds of things I teach about in my Global 2 class. And I think, I mean, the war of the last 10 days sort of brings it all really kind of front and center, these kinds of questions and the resurgence of the petrodollar that has really been pretty remarkable in the last 10 days. So we see how alive and strong it is. I think, one of the things I discuss in the book is how superficial and kind of false the analogy between oil and lithium is, right? And we hear it everywhere. We read it all over the place. Like journalists everywhere are sort of establishing that kind of metaphorical or an analogy between the two. And one of the reasons why lithium will never be the new oil is because of these financial and sort of currency questions that you're raising. We're not going to be trading lithium in the quantities that we trade oil because it's a very lightweight metal. So it will always be the relatively small part of all these, larger complicated systems that include like platinum, copper, so many other things that will be the really bulk materials. But also because, we don't put it daily in our car, right? We buy it every 10 years, hopefully in a battery. And so any kind of supply disruptions, there's no Strait of Hormuz equivalent for lithium, right? Or for batteries. These are systems that are just the timeliness of the supply chain is just completely different from oil flows where the dailiness does matter. So yeah, so I don't think I think we're going to see a very different kind of speculation. But I think ultimately what this points to is why this is, why we're going to be continuing to live with oil for so long. It's not just baked into our cars, our cities, our consumer goods, our production of everything. It's intimately tied into our entire financial system. And so I think that the war of happening right now is just a really good reminder of that. It's just how locked in we still are to an oil economy, primarily because of these financial and currency questions. I don't see any successor to oil. And I think for the United States, current government policy, ultimately, kidnappings in Venezuela, bombings in Iran, it's all about countering China's influence, after China has sort of been saying, oh, we're going to turn the renminbi into the currency of choice, and we're going to, really work towards, a multipolar world, or a new, what we've ended up with is a new bipolar world. And I think that's sadly becoming increasingly clear.
Thank you very much. That's a sobering, but I
Yeah.
think an appropriate way to end what's been a really interesting, fascinating, and provocative discussion and presentation. Thank you so much, Javier, for this. I really look forward to reading the book.
Yeah.
And thank you for the other materials you produced around it, this public-facing materials. I think that's so important for us, at least in our work, and I'm sure it is in Latin America too. Thank you for that. Thanks, Craig, for your very thoughtful comments and questions. I hope the work goes well with you in Argentina. And thank you to our audience for participating in a really interesting engagement and great questions and thoughtful responses. Thanks to everyone. It's been a really great session. It's a wonderful way for us to close out this term's critical mineral seminar. So thank you so much. I'll give everyone a heads up that we'll be starting up again in September. We've already got some things lined up, including a book launch. So please stay tuned to our website, www.aegt.ca, for further information, where you will find a recording of this session. Thank you once again. It was a great session. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thanks to
Richard.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Good night.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.